Hello, church family. Welcome back to FBC Extra. We're kicking off 2023 talking to our beloved pastor teacher, Tyler Scarlett. Last year, we went through the first half of 1 Samuel, and we will be finishing it up in the spring. But before we move forward, let's talk with Pastor Tyler about some details we may have missed in the first half of 1 Samuel.
Well, I'm really excited to start off another year of FBC Extra, the same way we did last year, talking with Pastor Tyler Scarlett. Pastor, how you doing?
I'm wonderful, Matt. Thank you. It's good to be back.
How's the foot?
Oh, the foot's doing well.
That's good. That's good. I'm glad to hear it. Now, I got to brag on Pastor Tyler for just a second because many of you know that we got married back in November. What many people don't know is the tumultuous couple of days Tyler had to go through to make that happen because we actually got married November 13th on a Sunday. And the reason we did that was because we started dating a year earlier on November 13th. So we just decided to do our 1-year anniversary, just be the wedding.
I didn't even know that. Okay.
Yeah. And well, and funny enough, I also proposed May 13th, which is exactly 6 months either direction from November 13th. So I know exactly when I proposed. I know exactly when and I did that so that I could know exactly when I proposed, know exactly where we got married, and when we started dating all in one. I don't have to think. I can just go 6 months one direction and I got it. Yeah, it works out very well for me. So, of course, November 13th fell on a Sunday.
Right.
And I remember early on, we had conversations about, well, it's a Sunday. Can you still do it? Are you still going to want to do it? And you were like, yeah, you were open to it. And we kind of talked through how that would look. Well, then the other thing we didn't realize is that the Saturday before the 12th was the Richmond Marathon. And he, of course, many of you know, he runs very avidly, and you were training all semester. We were in premarital counseling in the fall.
Right.
I remember you sent me a text after you finished that was like, well, I finished. I did something to my foot and walked to the end, but I finished, which was awesome, great accomplishment. But, you know, I got to go to the doctor. I got to figure out what's happening. Jenna had already left to go to her quarters. We weren't going to see each other again until we were she was walking down the aisle. And you had said, you know, I have a fracture in my foot. And we went, oh, no. You know, oh, no. You had a cast the next day. And not only did you have to do one, you had to do 2 services and then do our wedding at 1:30. Our wedding was 1:30 in the afternoon. So this man drove to Richmond, ran a marathon, fractured his foot, came back, went to the doctor, woke up, preached 2 sermons in a cast, sitting in a chair, and then came out to Elkton Farm Road and performed our wedding.
And hobble out there with my giant cast on my foot.
It was just incredible. I couldn't believe it. And I was so honored that you were willing to do that for us. Crazy 24 hours for you. And I'm so thankful that you pushed through it. But that was a Herculean effort, my friend. That was unbelievable.
And I'll tell you, when I got home after your wedding, I definitely crashed. I slept harder than I have in a while.
Imagine. And we're thankful that we had Reed. I had Reed as one of my groomsmen. He had the plan. He stepped in for you during the rehearsal. So we were relieved in the sense that if something happened and you couldn't go, we had Reed, the backup quarterback, ready to step in and who knew all the plays. So, you know, it was good to have that just in case. But we were so grateful that you were willing to do our wedding, even under those circumstances. And I'm tickled because we just got our wedding photos back. And it's so funny to see you in a cast in the photos. And I'm hopeful that that's the only, and selfishly, I'm hoping that that's the only wedding you ever do where you have a cast, because 20 years from now, hopefully when we're talking to our kids, I'm hopeful that they'll say, why is your pastor wearing a cast? And I'm going to say, well, actually, he ran the Richmond Marathon the day before and fractured his foot. And this is the only wedding he ever performed with a cast.
I hope it's the only one, too. I hope that never happens again. So
kind of a cool little twist of the photos. I also have your sons in half our wedding photos, too.
I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. It's not a big deal. Yeah, so the wedding was beautiful. We appreciate your work, not only with the premarital counseling you did for months with us, but also, you know, the fact that you were willing to do our wedding under those circumstances. So church family, we are blessed with such a good pastor, teacher, and shepherd. And well, I didn't just call you here to talk about wedding stuff. Today we're going to dive into 1 Samuel again. And the reason I wanted to do this was because the last time we talked, we did Pepper the Pasture. We gave you a lot of different curveballs to hit. And this time around, and then after that point, we began our study in 1 Samuel. And 1 Samuel's been great. I love the fact that we go through books expositionally because we get a chance to, we hit all these different passages that maybe we wouldn't hit. We have to deal with a lot of different themes. And with that, especially with this series, I felt like there was a lot of times that you would say things like, well, I wish I had more time to unpack this, or this deserves its own sermon, or this has its own thought. And I felt, you know what, we've already grilled you on random questions. Now I want to go more in depth with specific things in 1 Samuel that maybe you didn't get to talk about as much as you would have, that we could gather and garner some insight on. So I think this will be a really, especially as we pick up in the spring with the second half of the book, since we finished the first 15 chapters, I felt it would be really good before you ramp back up into 1 Samuel. We take a deeper look at a lot of the really incredible themes and topics that we've seen so far. So obviously, 1 Samuel, it's written by Samuel, correct?
Most likely he wrote portions of it. We don't know for sure who wrote it in the end, because 1 and 2 Samuel was one book, and so by the end, there's some details that others might have filled in, but it's certainly named after him because he's such a prominent character. So we most likely have some of his writings as the foundation.
And we started right off the bat in chapter 1, and we got straight to Hannah's prayer for a son. And obviously we know that the Lord had closed her womb, and not only was Hannah anxious to have a son, but she was also understanding of Israel's spiritual problem. So Hannah prays for a son, and Hannah gets a son. Chapter 1 is that story of Hannah going to the temple, praying, receiving a son, and not only that, but dedicating him to the Lord's service. So in chapter 2, we see Hannah's prayer based on chapter 1. And I remember you said in that sermon that Hannah's prayer deserved its own sermon. So I wanted you to have an opportunity to talk about what is so impactful about this prayer she gives in the first half of chapter 2.
Yeah. So, Matt, I think this is a great podcast to do because a lot of the church members that are listening, followed the first 15 chapters. Yeah. We're about to start back up again here soon. So it's good to kind of review and look back on things. So if you're listening and want to get the most out of this, and Matt, I know you got a Bible. So
yeah, I've got mine right here.
Turn to chapter 2. And as we go through this, I'll maybe talk about some specific verses or words to kind of show what I mean about some of these issues. So if you just look at chapter 2, in fact, just visually look at it, you can see verses 1 through 10 are center justified in most Bibles.
Yeah, it is in mine as well.
Correct. So they're set apart, which tells us this is a like a song or poetry. And it says, verse 1, then Hannah prayed and said, but it's clearly written in verse, like it's considered that. All right. So the way we talk about this is one of the oldest examples of any kind of Jewish poetry, right? Anywhere in history. And when we think of Jewish poetry, we think of what? We think of the Psalms, right? 150 chapters. And so a lot of people will say, in fact, commentators will say, well, 1 Samuel 2 is a lot like the Psalms.
Oh.
But if you think about it, it's actually the Psalms are a lot like 1 Samuel 2.
Oh, yes, much earlier.
Hannah's prayer predates David by 50 years.
Wow.
And so if anybody ripped anybody off, it's David, like building, like where did he learn this from? Like we all give credit to David for these amazing poems, these amazing songs. But they're actually patterned a lot like after what Hannah did.
So David could have been sued for copyright infringement.
Yeah. Like most singer-songwriters.
Yeah.
Yeah, so chronologically speaking, Hannah predates David and all the Psalms. So this is like the prototype for all the Psalms. This is the first kind of key example of an extended. There's a few examples earlier with Moses and the Song of Deborah, but this one really stands out in the way we see the Psalm. Another key point is that it's just a psalm by a woman.
True.
None of the Psalms of the book are by women, and again, we have Deborah and a few others, but this one really stands out as unique given the role of, men in culture then. This is not a psalm of Eli the priest, right? So this is not God is not interested in status as much as he is faith, right? You'd expect the priest to be the one to write a praise song, which is interesting. I think in terms of another detail that's fascinating, verse 6, you notice verse 6 in her prayer, she says, the Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. This is one of the first references anywhere in the Bible to resurrection.
Really?
So she says the Lord kills and the Lord makes alive. And then the way Hebrew poetry works, it's called parallelism. So the first line and the second line, if you notice, it's sometimes redundant.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, you just said that.
Right.
Usually they're just, it's intended to parallel, but it further explains the idea. Mm-hmm. So when he says the Lord kills, what does that mean? It means to bring them down to Sheol, which really means the grave or like to the tomb, mm-hmm. right? To be buried. And then he says, and so to make alive is also parallel to raise up.
Yeah.
So the structure is Hannah confesses a belief in life after death.
Oh.
And this is long before Daniel says something in Daniel 12 that in the end there will be a resurrection, right? You get in the New Testament, clearly, Martha says, I know there will be a resurrection, right? But it stretches all the way back. This isn't from the priests. This isn't from the prophets.
Yeah.
This is from a woman, Hannah, who confesses that the Lord will bring life after death.
Right, yeah.
To those that trust him. So just that little detail, it's like a little diamond in the middle of this incredible psalm. But I think what really stands out about this is that this prayer, and we won't go through the whole thing, this psalm is like a table of contents for the rest of 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Wow.
If you walk through, you know how you open a book and you look at the table and you can see each chapter?
Yeah.
Hannah essentially like forecasts what's going to come in this book as she prays. If you notice, when she says in verse 5, she speaks of the barren gives birth to 7, and she who has many children languishes. Well, that's the story of Hannah and Peninnah, right? Peninnah had the children, and she's miserable.
Uh-huh.
Hannah doesn't have children, but God brings her children in the end, right? So that's her story. Then we see that it's the Lord who, in verse 8, he lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them to sit with nobles. Well, what's the story that we're about to get to is David. David's the youngest son of the whole, right? He's the runt of the family.
Right.
He becomes the king who sits on the throne.
Yeah.
He speaks, where we see the Lord kills, the Lord brings down to Sheol in verse 6. What happens in the next chapter to Hophni and Phinehas?
Yeah, they get axed.
The Lord kills them, right? And so you can go through this chapter in detail, and almost every line stretches forward and points to something that's going to happen somewhere else in the book. And maybe most significantly is the last line at the end of verse 10. It says, the Lord will give strength, watch this, he will give strength to his king. Well, that's odd, because we don't have a king yet.
True, yeah, we don't.
Right? What does Judges say? There is no king in Israel, and that's where the book opens. But she is confessing a faith in God, and God is revealing through her something that won't happen for 7 or 8 more chapters, right? So decades will go by before this is fulfilled.
Wow,
and even
awesome.
more, after that she says, look at verse 10, and will exult in the horn of his anointed. Now the word anointed there, the king was anointed. Remember, Saul was anointed, right? David will be anointed. But that word anointed in Hebrew is the word for Messiah, or the word for Christ.
Oh, wow.
So she says, the Lord's going to raise up his king, and out of his king, he's going to eventually raise up the Messiah, the Christ.
Wow.
Which is when David steps on the scene, what does God say? I'm going to give you a son who will sit on the throne forever. And it's not Solomon, it's ultimately to Jesus, right? And so before David sees this, before Samuel sees this, Hannah sees this, right?
Yeah.
This woman who, in terms of status and culture, would have been a nobody from nowhere, right? Who was, even within her own family, was rejected, right? Because Peninnah laughed at her. Her husband hardly knew how to, care for her.
Yeah.
And yet she still has this undying faith and trust in God in the midst of it all, that the Lord can do impossible things, amazing things. And so, I just don't think this prayer gets enough credit. And the last thing to say is Hannah's prayer here, of course, every scholar agrees, this is the pattern for what will be Mary's prayer in Luke chapter 1. Remember, the angel shows up, says you'll have a son, and so then you have what's called the Magnificat, and her prayer, her song is the same as Hannah's, that the Lord raises up the lowly. He reverses your expectation.
Right.
Some people call it the Magnificat. I call it Madonna's greatest hit. That's the Virgin Mary, right?
Yeah.
But her prayer, her psalm, is an echo, a direct echo. Because in both cases, the women weren't supposed to have kids.
Right.
But by God's hand, they do. And God's plan of redemption is subversive. I love it.
Yeah.
It doesn't come at you through the front door. It comes through the window. He's not working through the big and mighty, powerful and strong. He's working through the women who trust him, who weep day after day, asking for God to give her a son, who just plead with him. And I think that's how God's kingdom works. He shames the wisdom of the wise, but the lowly, those are the ones he raises up.
Yeah.
His prayer's amazing.
Well, and also kind of a microcosm for the rest of the chapter, because we have her talking about some are going to honor God and some are not going to honor God. Samuel is going to honor God. He's going to start his journey upward, while Hophni and Phinehas are going to continue to come down doing the wrong thing, and they're going to be brought down. So we get to chapter 3, and chapter 3, Samuel is basically the assistant to Eli,
yeah,
correct?
Kind of an apprentice.
So now we're going to see Samuel get the call. And so Samuel's basically going to get called in this chapter in the temple, and you really keyed in on chapter 3, verse 3. And you said that you wish you had 3 hours to talk about this. So here you go. You've got 3 hours. Go ahead and talk about this.
Well, I won't take 3 hours. Well, if you go back to verse 2, all right, notice it says, and it happened at the time as Eli was lying down in his place, so Eli's the priest. Notice this parenthetical phrase. Now his eyesight had begun to grow dim, and he could not see well.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a famous scholar named Robert Alter, Hebrew scholar, who says there is no wasted motif in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, word pictures God's not just throwing in random stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so if he says something, there's some significance attached to it. So this is one of those cases where I think the author is using something literal to make a point that is literary, okay? When he says that Eli's eyesight had begun to grow dim, okay? So think of it this way. We could say that at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln stood tall.
Gotcha.
Right? That's both literal, right?
Yeah,
like he was
because
the
he was
tallest
actually
president.
tall.
We were 6'4",
Yeah,
I think,
very tall
6'5",
president.
something like that. But we also know that, from a political position, he took a stand. He said something that was bold, right? So that word kind of...
Yeah, so he stood tall.
It has kind of a double meaning there.
Gotcha.
This is one of those cases where when it says Eli's eyesight was growing dim, well, we know that because he has to rely on Samuel to get him around, right? So he's relying on this young man. But I think it's hinting at his spiritual blindness that Eli doesn't see, because what happened earlier? Eli, the priest, sees the godly Hannah but thinks she's sinning.
Right.
I think he's drunk.
Yeah, he can't tell the difference between prayer and drunkenness.
But his own sons are sinning right under his nose, and he doesn't see it.
Yeah.
Right? He lets them get away with it. And in fact, even joins them, as Samuel implies later, that he was actually getting fat on the sacrifices they were taking, that he says earlier, actually back in chapter 2. So he clearly, he can see a little bit, but he can't see clearly, right? So it's both physical sight, but it's also a hint at spiritual sight, which is why verse 3 then is such a great phrase, and the lamp of God. Now this is the menorah. Remember, in the temple, right, there's the candlesticks. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, right? So just as Eli can just barely see, right, now there's a little shimmer, a little glimmer of light. Not a lot, not a burning bush, right? Just the faintest hint. And what is it? The picture, again, which is literal, right? The lamp was, the wick is getting low, and yet what's happening spiritually? The nation is now about to be led by a boy. A tiny flame. A little boy who doesn't have a lot of light, if you will, but just there's something there that God is doing. God is keeping it going. And it's not the big Eli, it's now the teeny tiny Samuel that is stepping onto the stage. And so Eli was supposed to be, literally, if you know, of course, he's the priest. Sometimes they also have the role of prophet. There's an old word for it, a seer. Have you heard that before?
Yes.
It's literally a seer, like a hearer, a seer, right?
Yeah.
So Eli is the seer who isn't a seer, right? Like he has the role, but he can't see.
Wow.
Right? But what you have here, Samuel, he's not yet the seer, but he is the seer.
Wow,
Like
yeah.
he can see,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Even though it's small, he can see. And the Lord is now passing the baton, lighting the torch from one generation to the next. And so I think that's just like he's hinting that God's passing something off here. And then down in verse 15, I mentioned also, so Samuel lay down until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. But Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Again, why does it tell us he opened the doors? Like, he would naturally do that, but why is that added? Again, there's a lot of like Hebrew play on words here. But if you remember back in chapter 1, one of the things that the text stresses about Hannah, his mother, it says that the Lord closed her womb. 2 times. He closed her womb, he closed her womb. And then what happens by the end? The Lord opens her womb. Because now God's going to do something new by sending Samuel, right? So the picture here again is picking up, it's as if the presence of God has been shut on Israel.
Gotcha.
Because every man's doing what is right in his own eyes, right? The doors have been shut, and it's not Eli who opens it. It's the boy Samuel who's given this position to open it, right? So what has been closed will now be opened, and the presence of God will again make its place known among the people. And so that little detail, well, again, he's literally opening the doors. I think that's the case.
Yeah.
Literarily, it's hinting that he's about to open the doors prophetically in terms of revelation for the whole nation to see what they haven't seen for so long. So it's a really little striking details in the story there.
Yeah, it's so cool, and it does that, yeah. So Eli gets a tongue lashing of sorts.
Correct.
And basically, because of his sin, his line is done. And so Samuel's going to get the call up to the major leagues. Wow, God gave such a powerful message to a tiny little boy.
A fifth grader telling the pastor.
Wow, yeah, and so basically he has to carry out the message that Eli's line is done. His kingdom's going to be ripped from him. His sons are going to die. We see in chapter 4 that this is going to come true, where Israel's at battle with the Philistines, and the Israelites, they try to bring the Ark of the Covenant because they just assume, well, we'll bring the Ark of the Covenant, things will go well, right? That's the way it's always been. And they completely miss the point of what it was. And so they bring the Ark out in battle. They lose. Hophni and Phinehas are dead. Eli hears the news, falls back, dies. And it has a lot of emphasis on the chair there.
He was sitting by the chair at the beginning, right, of the chapter. He's here in the chair here. But then the next time the chair shows up is later when God says to David, I will put your son in the chair.
Gotcha.
We translate it throne, but it's literally the same word. He will be on the chair. And again, it's not Solomon, it's Christ that he's speaking of there, that he will sit and rule on the throne. Through Eli's disobedience, it was broken, but it will be restored in Christ.
Of course, in chapter 5, we turn our attention to the Ark, and we follow as the Ark ends up in Philistia with Dagon, and then God ends up sort of maneuvering his own little parade around the city, and I'm still trying to get my head around divine hemorrhoids.
Yes. So I made that comment, and I think it raised more eyebrows than...
I was not prepared for that.
Of course,
I was not ready for that.
So I'll explain this just a little bit here. So let me explain something that will help as to why with the Old Testament passage we have some differences in our translation. Because some translations say tumors. Some translations, actually, the King James says emerods, which is hemorrhoids.
Yeah.
So why would there be differences in this? Sometimes it's just a translator difference, but some of it is a textual issue. So let me just explain this briefly. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, right? And so it was written from basically 1400 BC, right, time of Moses, down to Malachi, the last prophet, 400 BC. So very easy, 1,000 years, Hebrew Old Testament. Okay, 200 years before Jesus, right, so 200 BC, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament was written, okay? Because by that time, Greek culture was huge.
Right, yeah.
Jewish culture wasn't that big, and so more people read Greek, and so the Hebrew scriptures were written in Greek, right, so people could access. Well, we don't have a ton of manuscripts of the Old Testament, like predating that era, but because of how literate Greek society was, we have tons of these Greek Old Testament copies.
Gotcha.
And so sometimes, and by the way, when you get to the New Testament, Jesus and Paul, right? There's 300 quotes of the Old Testament in the New Testament, okay, 300. Mm-hmm. 2/3 of them, 200 of them are from the Greek version.
Okay.
So Jesus read the Greek version of the Old Testament. Probably the Hebrew too, but he clearly quotes from the Greek version.
Okay.
Paul does the same. So scholars, when they are comparing these and trying to figure out some of these issues, they take this to be a very reliable copy of what we had when we're trying to fill in some of these things. So this is one of those kind of places where the Hebrew kind of says one thing, the Greek implies something else, and we're trying to put them together that way. So yes, in chapter 5, verse 6 says the Lord smote them with tumors.
No, you're right. We should bring back smote more often.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great word we need to bring back. Yeah, we got to say that more
There's
often.
some ESPN commentator that,
The Falcons smote the Saints,
Right.
Yeah.
So, yes, it has that term, tumors. And one of the reasons to think it actually could have been hemorrhoids is in verse 9, it says, after they brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city with very great confusion, and he, clearly the Lord, smote them into the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. Okay? Once again, we translate that politely, but the Hebrew literally says, so that tumors broke out on their private part.
Oof.
So it's quite literally, it says it broke out in the secret place.
Oh, okay. Ooh,
okay, so that's kind of Hebrew's way of saying it.
So it's clearly that kind of thing. It's a genital,
some kind of illness,
sort of,
malady.
Gotcha.
So, in the next chapter, there's the mice. Remember the golden mice?
Yes.
So many scholars think when you kind of piece this together, it may have been the bubonic plague.
Okay.
Because actually the word bubos from the bubonic plague, that's actually a lymph node that's in your groin.
Okay, gotcha.
So those can swell when a person has the bubonic plague, and normally you don't die of hemorrhoids, right? And they don't spread through, right? So it's possible that it was just a uniquely, miraculous sort of punishment that way, but it's probably, given the mice, some of the similarities there, the bubonic plague is how we would talk about it today as being part of it. But it clearly was some kind of abnormal growth that affected their private parts, and yet it was fatal, whatever it was. And so, it's just an interesting little tidbit to work through there.
Well, it doesn't matter. Either way, no matter which way you slice it, I'm giving the ark back.
Of course.
I'm giving the ark back no matter what. It doesn't matter what's happening. Yeah. Well, and then in chapter 6, the ark comes back. And I love the picture of being too familiar with God and not being familiar enough with God. Clearly, the Philistines have no idea what to do with this ark. They have no idea how to approach God. And they do their best, but it doesn't really look right. But, they make the golden statues and they send the ark back. And then, the Israelites get it back and they just fling the thing open and go, hey, let's just look inside this thing, and a bunch of them die. So in a lot of ways, the Philistines were able to treat the ark with more respect than the Israelites. So chapter 6 is kind of sad in that way. Chapter ends with the ark coming home, and in chapter 7, we get deliverance. And it feels like Samuel's ministry really starts to take off. Like he's working his way up, and he's kind of the guy now. Israel gets delivered from their enemies, and it feels like Samuel's the guy now, and things are going to go better. So then we get to chapter 8, and chapter 8 is interesting because it feels like it shifts because Israel now is demanding a king.
This is actually the beginning of the plot.
So
chapters
everything is
just
kind of introduction.
Introduction, setting us up for this key moment.
Gotcha. So now Israel wants a king, and we talked about how it's not really that they want a king that's the problem, it's that they want a king to do for them what only God should be doing for them. And so with that, Samuel's not too happy with this, God's not too happy with this, but we see Israel demand a king for the wrong reasons. And you talked a lot about in Deuteronomy, God had put stipulations in for a king, and so God was aware that this was kind of going to happen. This wasn't out of left field for God. God had kind of, had talked about this, and you talked about those stipulations. So I want you to hit more on what are the stipulations for the king here? What are we seeing?
This is one of those kind of complicated questions, is how can God, say you shouldn't have a king, and Samuel really say you shouldn't?
Yeah, Samuel's never about it at any point.
All,
he hates
right?
it. Yeah.
And yet in Deuteronomy, yes, God put in Deuteronomy 17, there's 6 or 7 verses where he gives, when you have a king, you do X, Y, Z. All right. So the best way that I can explain this is that a king, right, an earthly king, like God's supposed to be their king, but an earthly king was a concession on God's part.
Gotcha.
And he, being God, knew that was going to come to that.
So is it like the marriage concession?
100%.
Yeah. So it's not supposed to happen, but he's giving some concessions for it because he knows it's going to happen.
Right.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
God never commands divorce.
Right.
Nowhere in the Bible does he command it. But knowing humans, knowing our sinfulness, right? Knowing, as Jesus says, Moses knew the hardness of your heart, God had to regulate it.
Gotcha.
Because otherwise, if Israel just had a no-fault divorce policy like we do today, it just, anything goes, people divorce for whatever reason. And so he gave stipulations, right? If you're going to do it, here's how it should be done.
Right.
It was not God's plan from the beginning, right? Because his plan was one man, one woman for life.
Right.
But knowing that, like women in particular would be taken advantage of, left out in the cold, God's regulating it because he cares about everyone made in his image, right? And so likewise with Israel here, it seems to be that him putting those regulations in was giving them a concession that would allow them to have God as king and to have a man as king. Because, again, if you read Deuteronomy 17 closely, like he wasn't acting like a normal king. In Deuteronomy 17, you don't have to, I can read a section here. Like, what do you think of a king doing? You think of a king sitting around with his scepter, right, giving commands, giving laws, do this, do that, those kinds of things. But the job description that God gives here, totally different.
Yeah, very different.
He says now in Deuteronomy 17:18, now it should come about when he, the king, sits on the throne of his kingdom, what does he do? He shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the priests. Like he was to act more like a scribe.
Right.
And spend his days not, just giving out commands willy-nilly, but literally copying the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. You know how long that would take, right?
That's a lot of writing, yeah.
It's a full-time job. And so God is saying, you can have a king, because a lot of nations have kings, but I want to give you a shape of a king, not like what you're used to. You're used to kings who, again, ride on horses and wear crowns and say, look at me. I want a king whose nose is in the book.
Yeah.
Spending his time listening to God's word. And so verse 19, he shall read it all the days of his life. So even after he's written it, he's not done. He's got to keep reading it the rest of his days, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by observing all the words of his laws and his statutes, and that his heart may not be lifted up above his countrymen, which, by the way, we have no record of any king ever doing this.
Oh.
There's no reference that any king ever actually followed through. Maybe they did. But, as time goes by, what happens? After David and Solomon, right? David did the most of anybody. They actually lose the Torah. And they have to find it, during the exile. And they're, oh my goodness, where did this come from? Please read it to us, right? So it's clearly not a priority for them to have. And so, again, I think it goes to show that, God can use human categories, but he wants them in such a way that they honor him first and foremost. Right? So, my kids ask me all the time, like, can you be a Christian and play in the NFL because you have to miss church on Sunday, right? That's one of their kind of questions. And, obviously there's lots of issues on that, but I think there is a way in almost any job that we can actually honor God, but we've got to make sure that we're fearing him first and putting him first. And Israel could have a king, but it was not supposed to be a king like the nations, a king like God intended. And he was literally somebody just copying the Bible, reading the Bible, thinking about the Bible. So he was both a king and a kind of prophet priest, which, again, ultimately, what do we have in Jesus? He's the prophet, the priest, and the king.
Yeah.
He's all three rolled up. That's what Israel needed. That's what we've always needed from the beginning.
And when it says that he shouldn't turn to the right or left, you sort of correlated that to the cows that were lowing.
Oh, yes.
Where they weren't turning to the left or to the right.
Right.
And how there's something tied in there because the cows were not pregnant cows, they were nursing cows. Right.
They just
gotcha.
Just had calves,
Right.
locked the calves up, and sent it back, and they said, will it go straight way, and it's clearly it did not turn to the right or to the left, meaning this cow under the hand of God is more like the king that Israel needs.
Right. Oh,
right?
man.
I mean, literally, because what does Saul do? He immediately turns to the right and to the left.
Yeah.
Right? Concerned about his own reputation or whatever else. And so there's just a little hint there that this is getting you ready for what God's going to do and should be doing, but of course the kings of Israel are not going to listen. So,
well, and then we get into, in the sermon for chapter 8, you went back to Romans 1 with the whole idea that Israel wants this king and God's going to give them something he doesn't really want to give them, but he's saying, okay, you can have it. And you brought it back to Romans 1 where, God is giving people over to sin, saying you can have it. So I just want you to talk a little bit about that sort of correlation that you made.
Yeah, so I think in that case, again, God, C.S. Lewis famously said there's only two kinds of people in the world. Those who say, thy will be done, and those who say, my will be done. And God says to those people, fine, have it your way. Right? Like, see what they, right? God is always constantly, trying to keep us from harm. He gives us his law. He shows us what's right. He's revealed himself to us. But sometimes humans just don't want to listen, right? And even his people in this case. And so God is saying, fine, you can go down that path, and yet God is still going to redeem them, like from exile even. Like he's going to be there for them because they're his people, but they've got to learn this lesson, right? And learn it the hard way. And so sometimes God gives us, the old cliche, he gives us enough rope to hang ourselves with, right? Like he lets us run, get ourselves in trouble, but what does it do? It makes us turn back to him. It reminds me of Jonah. God doesn't stop him from running, but he allows him to get to the point that he hits the bottom, he goes as far as down as he can, so that what? Chapter 2 of Jonah, the only place he can do is look up. Like he's in the ocean. Where else are you going to look but up?
You got to look up. That's all you can do.
So he looks up to God and God brings him out. So I think that's what God's doing. Like he's wiser and smarter than we are, and he can navigate in such a way and ordain things that brings about what he wants.
This was part 1 in our in-depth look at 1 Samuel. Next time we'll finish up part 2 of the book with Pastor Tyler. If you missed any of the sermons from the series, you can catch up on the FBC podcast, YouTube channel, or forestbaptistchurch.org page. We'll see you next time.